I see a battle fully joined right now. I see echoes of 1800. I see echoes of 1920. The Koch brothers are raising $899 million. Two people, with the help of 300 other rich folks, to essentially subvert American democracy. This is very similar to what was happening in the United States in 1799 and during the John Adams presidency. During the John Adams presidency, we saw basically small d democracy sliding away. The most visible point, of course, was the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. This was all the 1790s. And it was reversed by the American Revolution of 1800, Thomas Jefferson's election. And, Dan Sisson wrote the book on that, the American Revolution of 1800. That reversed our slide toward oligarchy. We had another slide toward oligarchy in the 1920s when Harding was elected in 1920 on a platform of more business in government, less government in business, right? Deregulate and privatize. They deregulated the banks in the early 20s. The stock market exploded, and then it crashed in 1929. But the oligarchs had complete control, or large chunk of control over the American economy and the American political process during that period of time. Let us remember what Vice President Henry Wallace said on April 9th, 1945 in the New York Times. I know I bragged on this at some length yesterday, but I want to go into a whole lot more detail on this today. Vice President Henry Wallace said, "They claim to be super patriots, but they would destroy every liberty guaranteed by the Constitution. They demand free enterprise, but they are the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest." Now, you tell me that the people in that room with the Koch brothers are not the spokesman, and the Koch brothers themselves, for that matter, are not the spokesman for monopoly and vested interest. Their final objective, the Vice President of the United States said in 1944, their final objective, talking about the economic royalists, the fascists in America, actually was the word he used. Their final objective, toward which all of their deceit is directed, is to capture political power. Now listen to this very carefully, because this is what happened in California over the weekend. And this is what's going on all across the United States, is to capture political power so that using the power of the state and the power of the market simultaneously. See, these guys already control the power of the market in the United States. What's the one thing that regulates the power of the market? What's the one thing that can restrain the power of the market from essentially destroying democracy, not to mention the middle class? The one thing that can hold that back is the power of the state, right? Their final objective, Vice President Henry Wallace wrote in the New York Times, April 9, 1944, their final objective toward which all their deceit is directed is to capture political power so that using the power of the state and the power of the market simultaneously, they may keep the common man in eternal subjection. Now, what does eternal subjection mean? Well, that's an interesting one. Zed Jelani wrote an interesting piece over at Alternet. It's published, I believe, yesterday. He said, following the 2014 elections, Republicans gained more power in state legislatures than they've had in their party's history. This goes all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. Republicans control 69 of the 99 different state chambers in the country. More than at any time in the history of America. And I would submit to you that the reason why is because of money from the Koch brothers and other billionaires aligned with them, associated with them, or thinking the same way they do. Big corporations. You can track this back to the Powell Memo in 1971. In 1980, David Koch ran for vice president of the United States on the Libertarian ticket and lost. And now, he wanted to be vice president. Now he simply wants to control everything. He arguably has a hell of a lot more power than any vice president ever would have had right now. So what are they doing with this power in the 69 of the 99 state legislatures? They're quoting Zed Jelani's piece, GOP's frightening plot to build laboratories for plutocracy in states they control. You see, this is an existential battle for the future of democracy in the United States, for the future of the United States. Are we going to be a plutocratic nation, or are we going to be a middle-class nation? That's the question. Yesterday, when I left here, a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern time, I hopped in an Uber car to go over to my chiropractor's office. My back went out a couple days ago, and I've got a really great chiropractor. So anyhow, I'm on my way over there, and the guy who picked me up has got Michael Savage playing in his car. Full volume. It reminded me, that Michael Savage is a brilliant talk show host. He really is. It also reminded me of the value of personal narratives, because he was telling stories, which he does so well. But the thing that had me almost choking was his periodic insertion of gratuitous attacks on, and straw man attacks on progressives. Say, well, and progressives don't want you to have this. Progressives are going to destroy the country. That sort of thing. There is a right-wing propaganda infrastructure in the United States that is large and real. It is the talk radio infrastructure and Fox News. Fox News is owned in large part by two billionaires, Rupert Murdoch and Saudi Prince Al-Walid. These two guys own Fox News. So you've got Fox News as the official voice of plutocracy. I mean, it's owned by two billionaires. You've got the Republican Party now owned by two billionaires, the Koch brothers. So anyhow, back to the states. He says, last year, Republicans introduced a flurry of religious freedom bills designed to legalize the ability of a business to discriminate. For example, a diner refusing to serve gay people. Number one. Now, this is the sort of stuff that they use to get you to vote for them if you're a bigot, if you're afraid of gay people, if you're a homophobe, right? This is slicing and dicing the electorate. But the real goal is, for example, attacking labor organizing. In Wisconsin, Republican lawmakers are advancing a so-called right-to-work legislation, writes Zed. In New Mexico, Republican Governor Susan Martinez has no such reticence in endorsing right-to-work of her GOP lawmakers. At even a lower level in Kentucky, numerous individual counties are advancing this anti-union legislation. Next, cutting taxes on the rich, starving their states of revenue. Sam Brownback blew a hole in state finances by cutting income taxes, Zed Jelani writes. But the rich saw all levels of income saw a reduction, but the rich saw their taxes cut almost in half. That resulted in a budget deficit of nearly $1 billion. How is Brownback going to pay for that? Cutting $127 million from schools and delaying pension payments. In Texas, Senate Republicans are pushing for another $4 billion in tax cuts. In Maryland, where Republican Larry Hogan won, they're soon going to get this. Hogan set plans for, quote, an array of permanent long-term budget reductions for public schools, private colleges, libraries, and economic development aid for farmers. Now, this goes from the Koch brothers all the way to Davos. I want to share some thoughts on Davos with you in a few minutes as well. But we got a serious problem. A serious problem.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
At least the American middle class has a serious problem. The middle class has slid below the 50% line, and it's getting worse. It's going to get a lot worse. Just to revisit this rant from yesterday. I started out this thing, and keep in mind, fascism is the merging of state and business enterprises. Now, over the weekend at the Koch brothers retreat, you had a bunch of business enterprises people getting together and basically deciding how to take over the state. Now, back in 1944, the New York Times asked Vice President Henry Wallace to quote Wallace. The New York Times asked him, quote, to write a piece answering the following questions. What is a fascist? How many fascists have we? How dangerous are they? And here is what he said. And just think about, by and large, the right-wing network of radio stations across the country. There are two of them that are two major networks of right-wing radio shows. One is largely owned by Bain Capital, made up of billionaires. The other is largely owned by Cumulus Media, which is owned by a couple of billionaires. Or multimillionaires, I'm not sure. And we've got this, and by the way, this show is also syndicated on that network. But nowhere close to the extent that they syndicate their right-wing stuff, that they push their right-wing stuff into large markets on big stations. So what did Henry Wallace write? He said, the really dangerous American fascists are not those who are hooked up directly or indirectly with the Axis. The FBI has its finger on those. The dangerous American fascist is the man who wants to do in the United States, in an American way, what Hitler did in Germany in a Prussian way. The American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how best to present the truth to the public, but how to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money and more power. Henry Wallace goes on to say, and again, think about the Koch conference in California. If we define an American fascist as one who, in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, there are undoubtedly seven. See, this is his definition. Somebody who puts money ahead of human beings. They are patriotic in times of war. He said, if we narrow the definition to include only those who, in their search for money and power, are ruthless and deceitful, they are patriotic in time of war because it is in their interest to be so, but in time of peace, they follow power and the dollar wherever they may lead. This is, he says, still another danger is represented by those who, paying lip service to democracy and the common welfare, in their insatiable greed for money and the power which money gives, do not hesitate surreptitiously to evade the laws designed to safeguard the public from monopolistic extortion. I would say their misuse of 501c3s and 501c4s is like right up at the top of the list. Right up at the top of the list. We'll be back. It's 20 minutes past the hour. Stick around. Minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So the oligarchs had their meeting over the weekend in Rancho Mirage, I think it was, in California. And they are building a network to take over America. As Vice President Henry Wallace predicted in 1944, seize the power of government so that you can manipulate the power of the marketplace, because the government defines the marketplace. This would be like if the New England Patriots, instead of just deflating balls, assuming there's some truth to that, which, who cares, frankly, but it's like if the New England Patriots, instead of just deflating balls, decided that they were going to take over the NFL. And they ended up taking over the NFL, and Roger Goodell is now working he's the head of the NFL, isn't he? Yeah, okay. He's now working for them. He's working for the Patriots. One of the teams. And so they changed the rules so that every time the Patriots are playing, Instead of starting at the 50-yard line, they start at the 30-yard line on their side, or on the other team's side, rather. So so they can run into the It's an imperfect metaphor, but anyhow. So what are these guys up to? I mentioned Brownback in Maryland. Today's New York Times, continued assaults on health reform, having failed to repeal the Affordable, this is by the editorial board of the New York Times, having failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act outright. Congressional Republicans are moving ahead with plans to dismantle it piece by piece. Earlier this month, the House passed a bill. This is the Republican-controlled House, passed a bill that all the Republicans voted for, all the Democrats voted against, by and large, that would undermine the so-called employer mandate, which requires certain employers to provide insurance or pay a penalty. 240 Republicans and 12 Democrats voted for the bill, while 172 Democrats voted against it. The bill was, by the way, called the Save American Workers Act. What was it that Henry Wallace said? The American fascist would prefer not to use violence. His method is to poison the channels of public information. With a fascist, the problem is never how to best present the truth to the public, but how to use the news to deceive the public into giving the fascist and his group more money and more power. This is all about power, and it's all about using power to make money. The Davos, Switzerland meeting that's been going on, the World Economic Forum. Around 2 o'clock this morning, Louise got up to take the dog out to whiz, and it woke me up. I'm not complaining. I mean, this happens all the time. And I couldn't get back to sleep, and so I put on BBC, and at a very, very, very faint volume next to my head, next to the bed. So you really have to kind of concentrate to listen on it, and that puts me back to sleep. I didn't want to take a Benadryl or a sleeping pill after reading that thing yesterday about these, anticholinergic over-the-counter drugs causing dementia. Thank you. No, thank you very much. So I'm laying there without a Sominex or whatever, and listening to this and drifting in and out of sleep. But I just started getting more and more upset by what I was hearing. There was a roundtable discussion at Davos that the BBC presented. And early on, Steve Forbes came out with this strenuous defense of capitalism. Listen to this.
Capitalism, better than any other system, enables people, as Lincoln put it, to improve their lot in life. They have the opportunity to move ahead. Free markets are allowed to operate with sound money, sensible low taxes, sensible regulation. People do move up.
Yeah, it sounds very reasonable and sensible, right? In fact, one of his colleagues, and we're not really sure who, because this is just audio and you can't see who's speaking. So I'm sorry I can't tell you who was speaking, but if you check out bbcworldservice.com, you can hear the entire thing, the entire hour-long conversation. Here's one of the folks at the conference talking about, here's what wonderful capitalism has done for the world.
I think it's important that we are not throwing out the baby with the bathtub, because I think we are kind of tempted to debate it in the current context. But in reality, I think we have to analyze the data and the facts. What Martin just said, the global emergence of poverty. I mean, people living in poverty, the share of the world population living in poverty. 1820, 94% have been living in poverty. 1950, 72%. 2011, which is the last number I could get hold of, 14.5%, right? So middle class, defined by $3,900 per purchasing power parity. In 1820, 2% of the world's population were in that category. In 1950, 23%, right? In 2010, 54%.
Well, nice statistics if you define the middle class as anybody making about $4,000 a year. We don't use that statistic in the United States, but I can get it where you could, $4,000 a year you can live on in some parts of the world. But the point is, what he was explaining was the rise of wealth, not as a consequence of capitalism. Although, all these guys at Davos were saying this is because of capitalism. He was describing the rise of wealth as the direct result of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution came about because of innovation. And it wasn't innovation by billionaires. Thomas Edison was no billionaire. Nikola Tesla was no billionaire. George Westinghouse, who was a very rich guy, basically stole Tesla's ideas, ripped him off, defrauded him, and built Westinghouse, built a giant economic powerhouse. But who provided that? Well, it's like the Internet. The Internet's making people rich. It's making billionaires all over the place. Who built the Internet? You and I did. Our government invented that. It was a project of, by, and for we the people. Now, Comcast and Verizon and AT&T, they want to take it over. End net neutrality. Don't do Title II. Oh my God, common carrier standard. We can't have that. We've got to have this Title X that Thune is talking about, Senator Thune. So anyhow, I want to continue with this rant. I think this is the existential issue of our time. We'll continue after the break.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
A little more from Davos, a little more from the Koch brothers, a little more from Henry Wallace. Stick around. As I said, I was in the middle of the night listening to BBC, trying to get back to sleep, and you can find this over at bbcworldservice.com. And it's titled, the show, it's a 1-hour show, it's titled A Richer World, But For Whom? And it's moderated by Evan Davis of the BBC. And the people who are speaking, Christine Lagarde from the IMF, Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Martin Sorrell, CEO of a giant advertising company, WPP, Klaus Kleinfeld, CEO of Alcoa, the company whose asbestos arguably killed my father. Also joining are Robert Schiller, professor of economics at Yale University, and Winnie Byanyima, executive director at Oxfam International. Now, she was sort of the token liberal in the group, and she had some really interesting observations. Here's the token liberal in the group at Davos pushing back about wealth and power. Clip number 5 here.
Of course, they are producers of wealth, but the issue is about political capture, that extreme wealth takes over the process of public decision-making. The rules of the market and the rules that govern society become skewed in favor of the extremely wealthy. And that's why you get unchecked, uncontrollable rise of inequality.
And that's what's happening right now. And what's the response of the very wealthy? Take even more political power. Put $1 billion or almost $1 billion into the political process so that the voice of the very wealthy and the very powerful is absolutely not only heard, but basically drowns out all other voices. And as Henry Wallace pointed out, their goal is to combine the power that they already have in the marketplace, which is massive, with the power of government. And the power of government is supposed to restrain the power of the marketplace. And this has been our historic understanding. You balance capitalism with regulation in a mixed economy like this. But here's what Winnie Byanyima, the executive director of Oxfam, had to say at this meeting that was put together by BBC at Davos.
This is about shaping the rules of the market in their favor. In an ideal situation, we would have all people shaping the way the economy is governed and society is governed. That is the problem, that extreme wealth results in political capture, and then from there on, public decision-making is in the interest of the wealthy.
Right. Extreme wealth results in political capture by the extremely wealthy. And here's an example of this. Remember I mentioned Sam Brownback? He gave a 50% tax cut to the very, very rich in Kansas. Blew a $1 billion hole in his budget. Susie Madrak, in an article over at Crooks and Liars titled "Lobbyists Got to See Kansas Budget Before Legislators Did," writes, and I quote, Governor Sam Brownback's budget director used a private email account to share a working version of the government's proposed budget with two lobbyists 3 weeks before it was unveiled to lawmakers. Who were those lobbyists? Well, one was a guy named Kensinger, who was a lobbyist for the Club for Growth. This is one of the groups that the Koch brothers, I don't know if they own it or support it or which. And this, yeah, tell the lobbyists, right? So back to Davos. Here's where it got. I mean, my head was exploding by 3 o'clock in the morning. At 5 a.m., I'm emailing Shane. Clip number 4, Shane. This is where finally the guy, Evan Davis, who's running the panel, he says, okay, are the rich parasites? Are they extractors? Or are they job creators? Are they producers? And interestingly, since there were 7 people there representing the interests of the rich, and there was one person there representing the interests of the other 99% of us, and that was the woman from Oxfam International. Well, rather than tell you how it came out, I'll just play it for you. Here it is.
Let's just do a little sort of show of hands of whether you think that the top 0.1% are net contributors to the world, or whether they're net extractors. They're very clever people who invent spurious financial products and take out very high salaries. How many of you here would say they're net contributors? How many of you would say they're net extractors of value from... Okay, I would say that was about 8 to 1 in favor of the contributors.
8 to 1. Gee, in Davos, 8 to 1, they think that the rich are just wonderful. No, what we are looking at is an all-out assault on democracy, and not just in the United States. This is what's happening right now with Greece. Greece has finally stood up and said, because, keep in mind, the fantasy of austerity, that austerity is the solution to the problems of an economy in a crisis, that the solution is to do what they did in Greece. And what did they do in Greece? They laid off tens of thousands of government employees. They cut their healthcare programs so severely that 35,000 doctors and nurses are on unemployment. They cut unemployment benefits, just like John Boehner did for long-term unemployment here in the United States. They cut healthcare the same way that the Republicans want to do with Medicare and Medicaid. They cut the same way the conservatives want to do. They cut healthcare so that if you're in Greece, you only get healthcare if you're employed, and if you're unemployed, you only get it for a year, and after that, tough luck. They eliminated all free health care in Greece. Now, one of the reasons why the Syriza Party, I think, came to power is because the Syriza Party, or people aligned with the Syriza Party, were putting together free medical clinics around Greece, staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses who had been laid off. So the people are going, we see who's concerned about us. They've got 50% youth unemployment in Greece. They've got 26%, core unemployment. Poverty levels have exploded. Suicide rates have exploded. People living on the streets, literally living on the streets, soup kitchens. It's the Great Depression on steroids. And the people of Greece this last weekend stood up and said no to the oligarchs. And the oligarchs are freaked out about this. Oh, my God. The people are rebelling. The people in the United States don't yet know what the oligarchs are up to. And they've got all these voices out there on the right, this vast right-wing radio network with Limbaugh and Hannity and Savage and Levin and these guys constantly trashing progressives and anything progressive and elevating conservative values as if they were the values of the average working person. And trying to say that conservative values or even Koch brother values are hating gay people, when it's not. The Kochs don't care about gay people. They're libertarians. Promoting gun rights. I don't think the Koch brothers care about promoting gun rights. Being tough abroad, it's an expansionist military policy. Well, no, libertarians generally don't do that. Well, why is it that the Koch brothers are supporting these kind of things and others of their ilk? Why is it that the industrialists are supporting this kind of nativism? Because it gets votes. It helps you take over the levers of political power. And what we have is the owners of industrial power in the United States, the owners of economic power in the United States, getting together, and they've been doing it in secret for 30 years, and now they're doing it in public. And I think that's a statement of how bad it's gotten in this country, that they can do it in public, and nobody except Bernie Sanders is standing up going, whoa, wait a minute. And saying, we're not satisfied with just economic power. We're not satisfied with making billions and billions of dollars. We're not satisfied with and by the way, that little show of hands you just heard from the BBC, he said that the 0.01%, the 0.01%, the 1/100th of 1%, the really rich, they're not happy with just having economic power. They want political power as well. Why would they want political power? Because political power is the only thing that constrains or restrains economic power. The only way that the average person can have any say in the political sphere, or in the economic sphere, is to have political power. And the Koch brothers and the right-wing machine and Fox News, owned by two billionaires, Prince Alawid and Rupert Murdoch, the Saudi prince and Rupert Murdoch, and this political system run by two billionaires, David and Charles Koch. And, all these networks around the United States, basically owned and run by billionaires or giant corporations that make billionaires. Their goal is to take political power in the United States the way that they have by and large in Europe. I mean, this whole austerity thing that was pushed by the guy who invented Reaganomics, as Greg Palast pointed out on this show last week, the guy who invented the idea of Reaganomics, invented the idea of austerity in Europe. What is it? It's destroy the middle class, destroy the working class, and create a country that is safe for the oligarchs. I would submit to you, and in fact, if I was sitting down with David and Charles Koch, I would submit to them. You don't want to be a rich man in a poor country, although your policies are heading us in that direction. I mean, in Greece, they've got tuberculosis rates have doubled because there's no health care system anymore.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
How can even the rich avoid things like tuberculosis? Well, maybe if you don't hang out with the average person, I guess that's it.